Good afternoon, everybody. We could just start by having everyone put their name and where they work or represent in the chat, and we'll get started as soon as we get our mass of people in. Good afternoon. As folks are joining, feel free to add your name, your organization into the chat. Hello, everyone. We will get started in about 30 seconds, a minute, just waiting for a few more folks to join. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I am going to get us started with a few updates. We are still waiting on our first speaker, so I will just make sure as they join, I will let them know, because we do have a bit of a full agenda today. So good afternoon. I see people are still joining. Welcome to our monthly Food Systems Advocacy Community Call. Thank you so much for joining us this month. Our theme this month, as our speaker is now joining, our theme this month is actually all about the Farm Bill, which is a really, really relevant topic. It's timely. It is right on brand for a lot of people in this call. I know personally, myself right now as well, and a really exciting time to learn more about the Farm Bill. I just wanted to give some quick Food Council updates, and then we will hop right in with our first speaker. So I just wanted to give everyone a quick 10-second update on our advocacy work this Maryland legislative session. So I just added our policy tracker into the chat. Feel free to have a look. This session, we submitted testimony on 15 different bills, one in person, 15 written testimonies. 10 of those were sent off to the governor and made it through and will become law in some sort of way, which is really exciting. Those bills, as you've heard about in other calls perhaps, really range on a wide variety of topics, from SNAP issues to local food procurement issues to the environment as a whole. So we're really excited that our work is reflected in the outcome that we saw at the Maryland General Assembly, which is awesome. So I am going to get us started by introducing our first speaker, and then we'll get right into our agenda. Our first speaker today will be Professor Garrett Graddy-Lovelace from American University. Professor Garrett Graddy-Lovelace researches and teaches agricultural policy and agrarian politics at the American University School of International Service. A critical geographer, she draws upon political ecology and decolonial studies to research agricultural biodiversity, conservation, agrarian cooperatives, land use decisions, and global impacts of U.S. farm policies. This includes community-based research, action with grassroots groups on the Farm Bill. She is a faculty affiliate for American University's Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center and an associate director for the new Center for Environment, Community, and Equity. So over to you, Professor.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me? Thanks, so nice to be here. And Jack, so nice to be here. I've got some students in the room, so we're merging things at class and a brief presentation, but I'll just begin with gratitude to you all for doing important work on the Farm Bill. And let me know, can you all see this now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So as Jack said, I'm teaching ag policy and agrarian politics at American University here in DC, Piscataway lands. And you all are deep in this, so forgive me if any of this is repetition, but I will say I've been working on the Farm Bill for like 15 years. People care about it so much more now than they used to. So already there's a huge momentum around learning about it in different sectors. You have public health, universities and sectors. You've got people doing soil, obviously climate, labor, migration, public health issues, non-communicable diet-related disease. So it is iterative, massive, complicated, and actually precludes civic engagement, I would say. So it is, the actual Farm Bill is 1,000 or so pages filled with acronyms and self-references to previous bills. So even people who study this for a living are constantly trying to figure out what the acronym stands for, what the title is, what the section is, and the acronyms change Farm Bill to Farm Bill. So it like prevents honest civic engagement in a really problematic way. And yet the momentum is growing to engage it. This is the list of the titles, which you all, I'm sure, already know. I think what's important and interesting is that this is the 2014 Farm Bill list of titles and the 2018. These were two massively different administrations, right? The Obama administration and the administration that shall not be named, and yet the exact same Farm Bill, essentially. So already you see that ag policy kind of doesn't map on to Democrat, Republican, even conservative, and liberal. It kind of upends those usual binaries, and really we're in kind of a neoliberal status quo with a lot of the Farm Bill. But it has this complicated and fascinating history. So I think that the key to understanding the Farm Bill is surplus and the secret crisis of surplus. So this research comes from the USDA National Agricultural Library, Special Collections in Beltsville, where I've been doing work with librarians there and archivists, and looking at how ag policy was talked about in the archives. It's how the USDA archives itself, frankly. And so surplus was talked about in the archives a lot, but mostly as a burden of empire and as a surplumage of empire. And so this was in the 19th century when the US was kind of trying to flex its muscles in the Caribbean and kind of develop its own kind of colonial settler version of itself, neo-colonial colonizer in the hemisphere, Western Hemisphere. But it wasn't until World War I where really the government got very involved in dealing with surplus. And so World War I, the US government decided that it would feed the people in the war, the Middle Easterners and the Europeans in the theater of war in the other hemisphere. And so they decided to incentivize ramping up production. So all of these farmers who had previously been growing for their own region or their local markets, obviously mostly white farmers and male farmers, but a whole regional diversity in the US, were incentivized by the US government to grow surplus more than enough to feed the war and to win the war. And there was a massive government effort. And so the prices were pretty high at first because the World War I, survivors needed food. And what do farmers do when prices are high? They grow more. So farmers were plowing up the prairie grass, these deep-rooted prairie grasses, and planting more single season wheat, and prices were good. And so the price signal sent back to farmers to keep growing. And then all of a sudden, the survivors got out of the trenches of World War I and went back to their own wheat fields and were growing their own wheat. And then prices started to go down. Now, what do farmers do when prices go down? They grow more because they need to pay off their loans. And so farmers were growing so much that by 1919, prices collapsed. And so all these farmers converged in DC to say, you, the government, got us into this mess. You've got to help us. Now, granted, it was largely white male farmers, but there was a whole class diversity, rich and poor, and political diversity, communist and capitalist. Were all angry about this, and they were striking. And what began as an economic crisis in farming infected the banks, and then it infected the broader financial system and led to the Great Depression. So the Great Depression has as one of its chief origins is that agrarian crisis, that financial crisis. And so there was this wave of foreclosures in the 1920s. And then obviously by the early 1930s, you had the drought of the Midwest plains. The real ecology of the Great West Plains happened, and the million acres of topsoil went into the air. And so when you go to the USDA today and ask them about the origin of the Farm Bill, they say when dust hit FDR's desk, it was born. So it was a ecological and economic crisis of overproduction that began the Farm Bill. And so we can really think about the Farm Bill as an honest recognition of the ecological and economic disaster of overproduction. And so the archives tell this story. They say that farmers in the Depression years, the 20s, 30s, 19s, were coerced into sheer competition, into this ruthless exploitation of their soil. Did this help the farmers? No, they actually destroyed themselves financially, competing with each other. Surpluses piled higher and higher. Farmers got no pay from the excess, and farm income fell lower. So Henry Wallace and FDR got together to do the Ag Adjustment Act of 1933. So supply management and price floors are the parity policy that was the origin of the Farm Bill. And so this, in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, if you knew someone who farmed in the US, they had a crop that was in the commodity program that had a rock solid price floor and a quota system that they couldn't go over, that was a vestige of the origin of the Farm Bill. Meanwhile, however, there was still overproduction because there was the Green Revolution and hybrid seeds and the fertilizer industry. And so this surplus was still happening. It was this problem. And the USDA archives calls it the farm problem, which is surplus. What do you do with the farm problem? You deploy it. So the nutrition title was a deployment of the foods of the farm surplus, and the archives call it that. They say it was anti-hunger, but primarily it was to get rid of the surplus. And so then by the time you get into World War II, there was, okay, let's ramp up production again. And then of course, after World War II, you got back to the problem of surplus again. This time it was deployed internationally as food aid. And so the geopolitics of market development, the US rose to superpower status, deploying surplus wheat to Pakistan, to India, to Iran, to Egypt, to Bangladesh through PO 480, which was the Food for Peace program. And so then you had this get bigger, get out. The US government, part of the US government was like, let's actually keep deploying surplus. This is working very well for us in the Cold War. And on the other hand, you had that vestige of actually, this is killing farmers. We have to have a supply management. So this kind of contradiction was the heart of the Farm Bill all of these years. But meanwhile, the farmers were not winning. Even with those exports and allegedly feeding the world, farmers were going deeper and deeper into debt because the parity prices were being eroded. And so by the time you get to the 1980s, you had the farm crisis, and you have all of these farmers take to the streets saying, you're eroding our farm gate price floor, and in the name of feeding the world, and it's not helping us. And particularly there was a strong Black farmer leadership, which does not get talked about in the farm justice movement. So a lot of my research that Jack and I are working on is about the amazing interracial solidarities and the farmer labor solidarities of the 1980s farm crisis. Which the Federation of Southern Cooperatives was at the lead on, and Jesse Jackson and others. Nevertheless, by the 1996 Farm Bill, all the parity programs were ended because it was illegal by the WTO for governments to intervene. So it was just like let the free market handle it. And of course, the free market is going to crash that farm gate price, and the number of farmers is going to decline, and the average size of the farm is going to increase, which is kind of the broader trend of the 20th century, but it got very acute in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, what do you do with all that surplus? Well, we've exported it away, much to the chagrin of farmers around the world who really hate the dumping of commodity crop surplus on their markets because it undermines their agrarian viability. But surely it's helping US farmers. And so this is what Jack and other students and I have been researching, is actually the median farm income from farming in the US is below zero. So farmers look rich. Because they're on a very expensive land base and because someone in the family is an accountant. But actually the farm income from farming has been below zero since the 1996 Farm Bill, which ended all of the parity and the supply management programs. So you've got this weird shell of a livelihood. And obviously there's these fat subsidy checks to the richest landowners to hide the broader agrarian crisis. But meanwhile, the companies who sell inputs are benefiting. They're doing very well. The companies like Cargill and Walmart that are purchasing are doing very well because there's this mountain of cheap commodity goods. So you've got this kind of hourglass figure of distributors and manufacturers that are getting richer and richer with more and more mergers and monopolies, whereas the number of farmers is declining and the debt is increasing. This is a new data on how the debt right now of farmers actually matches and exceeds what it was in the 80s farm crisis, which is really alarming. And meanwhile, this kind of sector-wide massive concentration, these numbers are a little dated, they're even starker now a few years ago. And who benefits from the falsely cheap mountains of grain is CAFOs, which have as their kind of main pillar is sheep feed grain. which has all these environmental impacts, which you all already know. I'm sure the Chesapeake Bay is dying from eutrophication, as is the Gulf of Mexico, that there's been some great environmental work mitigating that. The new data right now on the emissions coming out of CAFOs is so damning. And so this question of if we're really concerned about climate, we need to regulate CAFOs, but really the key of regulating them is stopping their kind of cheap fuel, which is falsely cheap feed grain. So if we look back at the Farm Bill, we see that commodities and conservation are surplus prevention, trade and nutrition are surplus disposal, credit and rural development are dealing with the fallout, economic fallout of rural America when farming is no longer a livelihood for most people. Research is an attempt to kind of, mitigate this, but it's kind of veering way too much into agrobiotechnology. There's a big movement, though, to have it go more toward organics. Energy is just a surplus disposal mechanism. That's renewable fuel standard and the mountain of corn. And then this beautiful horticulture and organics and miscellaneous are great add-ons, but really crumbs to the larger, commodity title and major titles. So I think thinking through the commodity title as not just a problem, which everybody sees it as, but as a powerful precedent, I'd love to kind of think through with you all. Is there a way to update that parity model for agroecological production or, racially diverse farmers? The conservation title obviously just got a massive infusement from the Inflation Reduction Act, which is so exciting, but needs to go toward racially diverse and diverse farmers, not just the usual massive landowners. And then the trade title really needs assistance so that it's not just a dumping of commodity crop surplus elsewhere, kind of a grounding in solidarity. And the nutrition title, which is so crux and under attack right now, still needs to move beyond just a commodity crop surplus mechanism disposal and really think about nourishing foods and moving toward families and households that need them. Much remains missing in the Farm Bill. As you all know, even more than I, these are the many things that are not there in the Farm Bill, like antitrust or even fisheries. There were a few wins in the 2018 Farm Bill. You all already know this, so forgive me, but LAMP, if you don't know this acronym, it moved from discretionary to mandatory funding, and this was all of the Good Farmers Markets programs got lumped together into a new acronym, which we're going to hold on to. FOTO, which is the Farmer Outreach Training Opportunities. This was all the racial justice micro discretionary programs got pushed together into mandatory funding, 50 million, and we're going to try, there's an attempt to get it up to way more than that. Heirs property was a victory in the 2018 Farm Bill. Hemp decriminalization, though that has not helped farmers of color, it's largely actually been a disaster. And food waste, there was some little stuff on food waste, but that obviously needs to be completely expanded. Definitely the Inflation Reduction Act is huge. It's like $20 billion going to equip and CSP these really great programs. So that is a massive kind of important thing for us to think about. And then obviously you all have been following the Justice for Black Farmers Act. There was the move at the last minute of the IRA to delete the words race so that debt cancellation would just go to disadvantaged farmers. And of course, all these Black farming organizations, it's so important to be in radical solidarity to get anti-Black racism called out at the USDA and a very strong focus on the racial justice aspect of debt cancellation. So here at AU, we've had these Farm Bill events. We had one in 2013. We had another one in 2017 for the 2018 Farm Bill. It was very powerful. I mean, just look at the list of people who were there. It was amazing. And then we had a triple special feature come out of that, which I'll drop the link to. It's fantastic open access articles, 15, all about the Farm Bill from an equity perspective. It's a great set of resources. And then in the last 2 years, we've started this project called disparitytoparity.org, which is an attempt to kind of update the supply management model for racial equity and for kind of a broader climate resilience. So we have a lot of essays. We've had a whole webinar series. We had Dolores Huerta join us and Raj Patel and George Naylor and all these great folk. And we're thinking about parity from a racial equity lens, that a whole new generation of BIPOC farmers want to farm and need to have land, but they also need a fair price because otherwise it's not fair to expect people to make a living farming. As we were developing the Disparity to Parity project, tens of millions of Indian farmers took to the streets and occupied Delhi for a year, risking their lives for minimum support price and to secure markets. So the urgency of a fair price for people who are farming, they're very well aware that they will lose their land if there's not a rock solid price floor and a guaranteed market. And if the corporations are allowed to be the price setters like Starbucks is, it's game over for small and medium-sized farmers. So I'll just end with a huge event that we're hosting this weekend called Pointing the Farm Bill Toward Racial Justice. It's at Airlie, and it's going to be live streamed, and it culminates on Tuesday with the Senate briefing with the Congressional Black Caucus and Feinstein and a few other senators' office. And then there'll be a big party at Eaton, DC, a debriefing. And what's going to be centering the Federation of Southern Cooperatives priorities, their civil rights, amazing, legendary federation.coop is their URL. And so the whole summit centers their Farm Bill listening session policy priorities, which are here. Maybe I'll just leave the slide up. I think that's all I had, so I'll just leave it here. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was really, really informative, and as always, just awesome to be able to listen in on. I certainly have a few questions, but I will give the space to anyone else if there are other questions out there, or if anyone would like to put them in the chat. I'm happy to read off questions. Yeah, we'll see. I'll give that a few seconds, and if not, I'm happy to ask a question before, because I know you are on a time crunch. If I don't, I was just going to ask, as far as you know, what is the current status of the 2023 Farm Bill and the kind of process as it plays out?
Sorry, Jack, will you ask that one more time? I think there's a delay.
Oh, yeah, of course. As far as you know, what is the current kind of status or process of the 2023 Farm Bill?
Yes, I might be frozen, but let me know if this is coming through. So we had Lauren Wustenberg and Chris Nybart, who are legal counsel for Debbie Stabenow, come and join us in class a week ago. And they say that even though the Farm Bill negotiations started slow, because IRA took so much time, the Inflation Reduction Act was such a beast of a logistical challenge, but then it finally worked. Actually, let me just try something else. See if that works. That they say that there's, they began the year afraid that they were way too far behind. And also the midterm election last year had a batch of new people in the House of Representatives who had no history with the Farm Bill. This often happens. Actually, there's such turnover in the House that there's a lack of institutional memory. But this year there was a huge issue with that, and a whole group of people in the House who are against omnibus bills as such, like against spending as such. And so there was this fear that this was going to be a disaster this year. However, the people on the inside, particularly people working for Stabenow, have expedited all of the hearings. They had 12 hearings in like 7 weeks. And so they've actually plowed through the hearings that usually take until the summer just in the spring, and are now doing marker bills. These are the private marker bills before they go public, but soon they'll be going public on congress.gov. And already there's doing a lot of negotiation and a lot of wrangling on what the major details are. Obviously, the work requirements for SNAP are one of the chief sticking points, but they're already kind of trying to solve all the other sticking points. So it's just 1 or 2 sticking points to have a showdown with this summer. So shockingly, there's optimism on the inside that this will pass by September, by the time that the 2018 one expires.
And there was just a question in the chat. I can read it off. What is the prognosis for agriculture where every food calorie has between 10 and 20 fossil fuel calories behind it? As oil and other fossil fuels increase in costs, how do we prepare to relocalize the production of table crops?
That's a great question. That actually is one of the, maybe it's surprising, maybe it's not, points of consensus across the House and the Senate and the Republicans and the Democrats, is that COVID pandemic proved that the current very centralized supply chain is a disaster from a resilient standpoint. So even if you don't believe in climate change as such, it is true that massive bottlenecks happen in huge food waste when there's labor issues or when there's a pandemic, or apart from like war and supply chains disruption from Russia, Ukraine, on top of climate crises. So actually, it's a huge consensus right now that regionalizing food systems is urgent. And that means, processing facilities for meat needs to happen not just in 4 places in the US with terrible labor conditions, but in many regional places. And then just more food hubs and more distribution channels and more regional markets, more regional institutional purchasing, So I actually feel like the regionalization of food systems will be a big win. I don't know if it will be in LAMP or if it will have to be its own kind of title. I don't know how that will kind of play out in terms of the Farm Bill form, but I do think it's going to be and maybe less for climate reasons on the Republican side and more just for kind of a national security resilience framework. And the Democratic Progressive side, definitely as a climate resilience and climate mitigation and climate justice issue.
I'm just going to give it a few seconds to see if there are any other questions. And if not, I will let you go back to your students who I know are probably waiting for you. Thank you again so much, Professor. If there are any more questions, I will send them your way. So if anyone has any questions or come up with any, feel free to drop them in the chat. Oh, there is one more. So we can do one more, I guess, if you have time.
Yeah.
Where are the best places to stay abreast of Farm Bill progress?
Yeah, good question. So I dropped the link to the special feature, which is more kind of like deeper analysis of the Farm Bill as such and ag policy. It's a great set of resources. In terms of like current what's happening in May 2023, National Sustainable Ag Coalition is the go-to for just day-to-day what's happening with marker bills, with this marker bill. So I would get on their listserv. In terms of kind of deeper analysis of ag justice or agrarian viability, the National Family Farm Coalition, that's nffc.net. In terms of racial equity, ruralco.org, they're very good on the Farm Bill and have a very strong racial equity, farm worker and indigenous farmer orientation. And then Heal Food Alliance has become a fantastic alliance of food worker, farm worker, climate justice, racial justice, and they've all of a sudden got a really great platform and all of a sudden are kind of one of the major players in terms of Farm Bill tracking and advocacy. Sierra Club, actually their food and ag team is getting quite good at this kind of nuanced analysis of how the Farm Bill is unfolding. Food and Water Watch is obviously one of the best on antitrust and kind of thinking through agro-business monopolies and the avenues for antitrust. Cory Booker is leading some of the work on moratoriums on CAFOs, which seems very promising. Also, the Farm Action is another one that is really strong on things like checkoff programs and the injustices of those, and on things like price gouging, like eggs quadrupled in price earlier this spring, and the egg manufacturers, egg industry had a quadruple profit margin for that quarter. So the obvious price gouging is being called out by Farm Action, a few others. Oh, good. Oh, yay, Erica. Sierra Club is doing great work on this. American Farmland Trust, Alianza Nacional de Campesinos is great work on farm worker analysis of how farm labor isn't even in the Farm Bill, which is racist through and through and classist, and yet they are forcing the issue of linking farm labor rights in a Farm Bill cycle.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Enjoy your afternoon. Yeah, thank you. Thank you again. And if, as I said, if people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I can relay them on and we will get answers.
Thank you all. And I'll just end by saying, even though the federal level is where we're all focused on right now, I actually think that the municipal level and the county level food policies is where the most integrative and exciting ag policy and food policy is coming from. So I love that there are these really robust county and city food policy councils, because those are going to be ramped up into the best federal policy in years to come.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Oh, that's great. Hank, he's my dad.
Thank you. I met Hank and Mike and your work in Kentucky. I'm so inspired by you all. Appreciate everything you're doing.
Amazing, Erica. So excited to connect. So excited to connect. Thank you.
Yes. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Garrett. Awesome. Thank you. Next, I'm going to pass it over to our next speaker, and we are going to continue on this Farm Bill theme and bring it a little more local here to Maryland. So I am going to pass it over to Elizabeth Epps, the Deputy Director of Maryland Hunger Solutions. So over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jack. And that's a tough act to follow. That was such an amazing presentation with a lot of really good history on the Farm Bill. I learned a lot, so thank you. Thank you to Garrett. I am going to start. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to get started. Hi, everybody. I want to thank the Montgomery County Food Council for allowing me to join the call today and talk about the Farm Bill and specifically protecting and strengthening SNAP through Farm Bill advocacy. So I'm going to dive right in. So I am a deputy director at Maryland Hunger Solutions, which I'm assuming most people on this call are familiar with Maryland Hunger Solutions, but for anybody who is new, we are a chapter of the Food Research and Action Center, which is our parent organization in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to say the word FRAC a few times. I'm talking about the Food Research and Action Center. And we at Maryland Hunger Solutions work to end hunger and improve nutrition, health, and well-being for individuals and families in Maryland. And our primary focus is overcoming barriers to the federal nutrition programs. And so that's really where our work focuses. And what we do to accomplish those goals, we provide education about the reality of hunger in our state. We advocate for state and local public policies that contribute to ending food insecurity and poverty. And we work to ensure that all eligible residents in the state are connected to the federal nutrition programs through outreach, training, and technical assistance. And we have a long and collaborative relationship with the Montgomery County Food Council, and we're very appreciative of the partnership. So our previous presenter did a really fabulous job of summarizing what the Farm Bill is and what the 12 titles are. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide and also just touch on where we are in the process. We're currently at in this nice little infographic we have here, we are at step 3, which is the hearing step before we go to conference committee and the House and Senate passing their respective bills. And so I'm going to be focusing on Title 4, which is the nutrition title, and that is the title that covers SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, as well as some other smaller nutrition programs that help connect individuals and families with food. So I just wanted to touch on the key players in our Farm Bill process. And so we are looking at the committee members on the House Agriculture Committee and the Senate Agriculture Committee. These are the folks who are busy drafting the Farm Bill. And while we don't have any members of our Maryland delegation or our Maryland senators on these committees, I did want to highlight that we have a member of our delegation, Andy Harris from District 1, who is now the chair of the Agriculture Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. So while he does not have jurisdiction over the Farm Bill, he is in a relatively powerful position when it comes to appropriations or funding for different agriculture programs. So I did want to highlight that. So before we dive into the Farm Bill, I just wanted to get a sense for where we are in our current SNAP landscape. And so as most of you on the call know, we are in the midst of a hunger cliff right now. In March, over 30 states, including Maryland, experienced the end of SNAP emergency allotments. And so these emergency allotments went into effect in March of 2020 and allowed all SNAP households to receive the maximum benefit that they were entitled to. And for folks that were already getting the maximum benefit, they were allotted an additional $95 per month. So this hunger cliff, the end of emergency allotments, impacted more than 360,000 family or households in Maryland. The average loss was quite drastic at $82 per month. The steepest cliff was experienced by many older adults whose benefits, some of whose benefits dropped from close to $300 a month to $23 a month. So really, we've been getting a lot of calls, as I'm sure a lot of you have as well, from households that are really struggling right now. And I just want to note that food banks are not able to fully compensate for this cliff. We know that SNAP provides roughly 9 times the number of meals compared to the food bank network. And I want to emphasize that food banks have a role to play, but they will not be able to fully compensate for this drop in benefits. And this is not on the slide, but the next month marks the end of the federal public health emergency for COVID-19. And so we know that with that, we're also going to be losing some flexibility and waivers related to access to SNAP for able-bodied adults as well as college students. So we're on the lookout for impacts on SNAP participation from the end of the public health emergency. And, you know, just to say that we are losing the SNAP emergency allotments at the same time that we are currently facing very high food inflation and high food prices. So the timing is not ideal for when these emergency allotments ended. So Garrett mentioned this in her presentation, but the main threat that we're facing through the Farm Bill with regard to SNAP is threats to time limits. And so in current law, the SNAP eligibility time limit restricts many able-bodied adults without dependents, what's known as ABODs, from receiving they receive only 3 months of benefits within a 3-year period unless they can demonstrate a sufficient number of hours worked. And this currently only includes adults aged 18 to 50. Aside from the Farm Bill, we just saw a proposal released by Speaker McCarthy that would increase the age, to expand the age to 56, so 18 to 56 for quote unquote ABODs. We also, there was a bill introduced by Dusty Johnson, who's a member of the House Agriculture Committee, that would increase the age to 65 for ABODs. And we also are seeing threats through the appropriations process of limiting states from being able to use waivers to improve access for able-bodied adults. So that's kind of what we're looking at right now. But on a brighter note, we also have some opportunities to strengthen SNAP. And so before I get into the federal kind of Farm Bill opportunities, we do have an opportunity at the state level to create a supplemental SNAP benefit. In other words, to raise the minimum benefit across all participant categories to offset the impact of the end of emergency allotments. And we do have a precedent in other states for this supplemental SNAP benefit, including New Jersey and Massachusetts. So far, this has not gone through we did not see a supplemental benefit in the Maryland legislative session, but we're still putting pressure on the governor's office and the administration to enact a supplemental benefit. So turning to the Farm Bill, we are looking at a number of different marker bills that have been introduced that would improve SNAP benefit adequacy and improve access to SNAP. So I guess I have enough time. So the first bill that we are excited about is the Closing the Meal Gap Act. And this was sponsored by Alma Adams in the House and Kirsten Gillibrand in the Senate. And that would boost SNAP benefits for all participants by replacing what's known as the Thrifty Food Plan, which is currently how the value of SNAP benefits is calculated, with a more appropriate low-cost food plan as the basis for the SNAP allotments. So we're excited for that one. The Improving Access to Nutrition app to Nutrition Act was introduced by Barbara Lee, and that would eliminate the 3-month time limit for able-bodied adults without dependents. And I've included a link here for a fact sheet from FRAC that is about the basically that quote unquote work requirements don't work to improve employment. They really just increase food insecurity. So I encourage you to check out those talking points. The SNAP Plus Act was sponsored by Grace Meng in the House, and this would permanently end the prohibition of the use of SNAP benefits on hot prepared foods. So we are excited for that. And then the last three that I wanted to note on this slide would increase access to SNAP for college students, for immigrants to the United States, as well as for people in the US territories, so Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and US Virgin Islands, as well as formerly incarcerated individuals. So those are some opportunities to strengthen SNAP this year. And I also want to emphasize that those of you on the call today from Montgomery County, as local advocates and service providers, your thoughts and experiences matter, and your local perspective, your kind of on the ground perspective, is really key to the decision making of your legislators. So we don't want them just to be hearing from lobbyists at the federal level. We want our legislators to hear from folks who are providing services on the ground. So some suggested steps for getting involved in the Farm Bill. The first step is really to identify what your priorities are. And I've included a link to FRAC's priority list as a starting point. So that includes a lot of the bills I just talked about for strengthening SNAP. And you can submit comments to the House and Senate Agriculture committees, kind of summarizing your priorities. And one thing I think is really important, and I think it's already been happening, but it's really important to be collecting stories to document the harm of the hunger cliff. And so those personal stories, whether you have a personal story or a client, friend, or family member, you can share them directly with the Food Research and Action Center. You can email me or just share them directly on social media, but we really encourage people to document the harm, because this is a really dramatic benefit cliff that we're experiencing. And you can reach out directly to your members of Congress and urge them to advance your priorities, whether that's by email or phone. And you can look up who your representative is by zip code. We all have the same senators, Ben Cardin and Chris Van Hollen. So, FRAC has a customizable email template that you can use, which I've linked here. After I stop sharing my screen, I'm going to share all these links in the chat so that you have them. And also, we in Maryland and in Montgomery County in particular, we're very close to Washington, D.C. So why not set up an in-person meeting with your members? That's a really great way to get in touch with them, and they always want to hear from constituents. So I would encourage you to use tips for Capitol Hill visits. This is a fact sheet from FRAC that kind of gives a step-by-step guide on how to set up a Hill visit. And we are, I think some of you on the call today are planning on joining the Food Research and Action Center and Feeding America are having our annual anti-hunger policy conference, May 7th to the 9th. So not this weekend, but the following weekend. And on Tuesday, May 9th, there will be a Hill Day for everybody to meet with their legislators. So if you are already planning on joining, I look forward to walking around Capitol Hill with you. And if you're not signed up, you can still sign up for the conference and join us on Tuesday for that Hill Day. And the last thing I want to touch on is if you have the opportunity to speak with the media to alert your members of Congress to your anti-hunger priorities, that's also a really great way to lift up your voice and to advocate for SNAP. And those are all my slides. So I'll include my contact information in the chat, and then I'll also include all those links.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I, again, do have some questions, but I will wait to see if anyone else has some questions first. And if not, I will go for it. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat, and I'm happy to read it out. And if someone doesn't, then I'll ask my first question. So I was just actually thinking about how without Maryland representatives on really the Senate or House Ag Committee, how does that really, I don't know if I'm wording this correctly, but to me, it would worry me that somehow the issues of Maryland fall down the list. And I understand there are a lot of states that aren't going to have representatives on these committees, but I was just kind of wondering, how do our other elected officials have this influence over the Farm Bill without being a part of these committees?
That's a great question. It is unfortunate because not having a seat at the table in the drafting of the legislation, it does reduce the input from our delegation, but the farm bills, once they are presented to the full Senate and the full House, there are still going to be amendments and changes made at that point. So I would say it's still really valuable to raise up your priorities to members of the Maryland delegation and our senators. And also, even if they're not at the table, they do have some power to shape the legislation. So I think it's still valuable, but I would say, yes, in the states that have people in high ranking positions, either on the committee or on the subcommittees, they have more say. So in future years, we can really push for members of our delegation to get on these committees. But for the time being, I do think it's still important to raise up those your priorities. And as I mentioned, you can reach out to the committees, and even though you don't have any members of our delegation on the committees, you can still raise up your priorities to the committees directly. So that's another way.
Awesome. I do have one more question, but again, I will give it a few seconds just to see if anyone else has any questions. If no one else does, my next question is more just like process wise. Garrett mentioned a little bit, like kind of September, October, like what kind of timeline do you kind of see with this, or when do you see the most involvement potentially coming, especially like you said, we'll have to wait if we're talking directly to our senators about things for it to kind of fully come out. When do you just kind of see people potentially having that opportunity?
The sooner the better is what I will say. If you are able to contact your legislators soon, like I said, we're having our Hill Day on May 9th. And I think that the hearings are ongoing right now, but those are going to be wrapping up soon. And as Garrett mentioned, it's kind of unprecedented for Congress to actually pass a bill by the deadline, but we are thinking it may happen this year for this to get passed before September. So I would say getting out in the next month or so would be my recommendation.
Lauren, go for it.
Sure, and I figured this is kind of a hard question to ask, but I'm just wondering, given what Garrett said about the fact that there are new legislators who are new to the Farm Bill, and there's a huge learning curve, it's a huge omnibus bill. I'm wondering if you all are getting a sense of the fact that, with our members of Congress, if there's sort of a balance in the tension between balancing like agricultural asks or all of the things we're talking about for local farmers, and then with the food assistance programming, and how you all in practice balance that as you're talking to lawmakers.
I don't know if I I'm the right person to ask that question because we are very, very focused on anti-hunger. So our advocacy is focused on the nutrition title. I think because our expertise is not really in the other titles, we don't really touch that. And also the reality is as far as the funding in the Farm Bill, it is about 75–80% for SNAP. And so it is a really big portion of the Farm Bill. And we know, given the threats that we're facing this year, and I should also just to be candid, we're pushing for those bills that would strengthen SNAP, but the reality is we do in the House, it's a tough battle to be able to pass those bills. So we're trying to also be pragmatic, but I'm not sure that really answered your question. I'm sorry, but our focus is really on the anti-hunger piece.
Carla, go for it.
I was wondering, do you think it makes sense, since you're focusing on the anti-hunger and the SNAP, to get with the, like the elementaries and the middle schools, because it really impacts the kids there, and maybe have them do like video commercials, or clips, so that you could send it to the legislation, like how the impact would affect them.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I think that is a great idea for being part of the story collection piece of all of this. Is to work with the schools. I think a lot of our work with the K-12 schools in recent years has been around school meals and expanding access to school meals, but certainly we know that children are one of the biggest demographics that participates in SNAP. And so it's important that children have access to school meals as well as SNAP. And so, yeah, I think that's a really good idea to work closely with the schools.
And you can also tie it into the testing scores, because the lack of food and so many kids that go home hungry, plays a part in the the impact of their testing scores. Like someone could look at the testing scores and see if there's been a dip in the testing scores, and, kind of tied into not having access to not just any food, but healthy food as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We do know that students with access to universal meals do tend to have better academic achievement. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? If we don't, I want to say thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us today, for sharing that information. I added some of the links that you had sent me earlier into the chat. I didn't get all of them in there, but the ones you sent me earlier will also be in the follow-up, just so everyone knows as well. If you don't get them out of the chat, they will be in the follow-up. So thank you so much for joining us today. With our last few minutes of our call, I just wanted to give kind of an update. I mentioned it earlier about our legislative session and the work the Food Council undertook during the Maryland General Assembly this year, and specifically kind of the process behind that and how it kind of came to be. So as many people know, the General Assembly ended on April 10th. Bills have been sent off to the governor's office to either be signed into law or passed through via just letting it go through law, not vetoing the bill. In total, the Food Council, as I said earlier, submitted testimony on 15 different bills. Of those, 10 were sent off to the governor, as I mentioned, and are expected to become law, which is really great to see. I said earlier, those bills have a lot to do with strengthening SNAP programs, increasing access to local foods, and overall strengthening the resilience of our food system in Maryland as a whole, and obviously Montgomery County as well. And then the one thing I want to touch on before we go is just kind of how that process plays out for the Food Council. So the Food Council, our testimony process is a very collaborative process. So we have 5 of our council members that are part of our policy committee, our voting policy committee, and we work as a staff collaboratively with them to draft testimony that is sent off to legislators. So testimony is typically drafted by staff first. It is then, after a bill is approved through our voting committee, so it is sent to our voting committee and they decide that it is worth it and we would like to have our voice be heard on this matter. The testimony is drafted by someone on the staff. After that, it is reviewed and edited by usually another staff member before it is sent off to our 5-person voting committee. So our testimony process is really, really collaborative. It works to get as many of our voices, and our policy committee represents and comes from different perspectives within the food system. And our goal is to try to use that expertise as much as possible and not just act as though we are the only voice on these matters. So our collaborative process is a really great way for making sure that our testimony is both as effective and robust as possible, and really speaking to the power of some of the bills that we hope to see get passed and that we did see get passed. So it's really great to see that. I also wanted to give my last thing here today a quick follow-up on last month's call and why maybe some of the bills that we supported didn't necessarily make it through. So last month's call, we spoke about the budget in the county specifically, but those budget constraints we talked about in the county were also seen statewide. So a lot of the bills that had large fiscal notes and things like that were ones that did not make it through this session. I know specifically one that a lot of people at Maryland Hunger Solutions, that people on the Food Council staff were really hoping for, was the Universal School Meals Bill, that did not pass this year, but we know it will come back next year, and we are ready to go again and hopeful that through continued advocacy and work, that bills that are hugely important to Montgomery County and to the state of Maryland as a whole will get passed as they move along or as years come by. That is the end of our call this month. We have 3 minutes left, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If not, thank you all so much for joining us. All links, presentations, which is a lot from this week, a lot of information this week, which is awesome, will be sent in a follow-up email by the end of the week. And the recording, if anyone would like to watch again or share it out, will be put up on YouTube tomorrow, and I will include that in our follow-up as well. So if there's no other questions, you can have 2 minutes of your day back, and thank you so much for joining us this month.